Welcome back to part 3 of our series on realism in fantasy RPG combat, where we are going over and doing some commentary on the essay by John Clements from 2003. In this video, we're going to be looking at weapon armor dynamics. Okay, next, weapon armor dynamics. John writes, different weapons do different degrees of damage against hard or soft armors. If this were not so, there would not be so many different weapons designed that are developed. Yet the degree of difference a weapon does against various armors is not all that profound. It is simply a matter that some are better at slicing or stabbing soft armors, and others are better at crushing, denting, or piercing hard armors, nothing more. For example, a special anti-armor stabbing sword is great against plate armor, but its thick, rigid blade does not cut at all. A wide, curved sword slices well against cloth armor, but has much less effect when chopping at chain-link mail armor. It can really all be reduced to the concept of +1 to +2 or -1 to -2. Further, a ranged attack, missile weapon, does not necessarily face the same degree of defense as a melee weapon engaged against an opponent. The missile weapon only seeks a target, and thus only faces armor and obstructions. The melee weapon, by contrast, in order to hit, has to be used in active fighting. The two do not necessarily encounter the same degree of defensive capability or capacity from the opponent. The bottom line, then, is that if the above is considered, there's no real need for more complicated weapon armor dynamics. I'm not sure about this one because I'm not sure how to interpret it. And in part, some of this is because he uses this vague word profound here, yet the degree of difference a weapon does against various armors is not all that profound. Well, I guess different people are going to have different interpretations about what exactly it means to be profound. I remember in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and Combat and Tactics, I think there were different modifiers for different weapons against different types of armor. And that was basically a +1, +2, or -1 or -2 situation. But I will note that in that case, of course, you are rolling a d20, and this is something that I think about a lot when designing games, and that the random roll of a d20 is quite swingy, and so a +1 to give you an advantage over a particular kind of armor if you're wielding a particular kind of weapon may not actually be all that much, may not be very statistically significant at all. So the idea of +1 or +2 or -1 or -2, that might have to change depending on what type of random number generator you're using. Gerps has some of this. A damage type is particularly significant in determining injury to a character, and some armors are better or worse at handling some type of damage types. Whether or not the relationship between armor and damage type is overdone, I think that's going to be a matter of taste. Kind of like how we were talking about what probably matters with how the two combatants are armed is something relative to one another. Here's another situation where you're going to have to be able to compare what the attacker has to what the defender has. There are probably only so many times you want to do that in a game, because that does slow it down. It's obviously easier if someone needs to perform an action like an attack, if basically all of the information that they have is sitting there in front of them. The more things that are dependent upon comparing some feature of your character to the feature of who you're attacking, the slower it goes, because all of the different PCs are going to be different, and it could be that everybody who they're fighting could be different. Maybe all of the goblins or the orcs that they're fighting are armed the same, so at least you know you're always comparing it to some kind of constant, but that does slow things down. So I guess it's the balance on getting the right amount of this. But I guess that's with everything, of course. Getting the balance right and getting just enough of something in there, but not too much. So I've got 3 games here that I checked up on, and then I also have some ideas with some tables that might implement this idea. The first here is that I went back over to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Option Combat and Tactics. I thought I remembered there being +1s and +2s and -1s and -2s for different weapons versus different types of armor. I couldn't find any of that, so I might have been misremembering. But I did find here that weapons are divided into 3 categories: bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. This describes the weapon's method of creating injuries and is used to determine what kinds of critical hits the weapon inflicts. And of course there were critical hit tables inside the Combat and Tactics books that did use the damage type of the weapon. It says, in addition, some monsters may be partially resistant to the effects of certain weapon types. For instance, skeletons take only half damage from slashing or piercing weapons. So in some ways, it sounds like not a whole lot has changed. We have different damage types in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but they really don't come into play all that much. Here, they're not coming into play very much either, except for some resistances, like in 5th edition, where we also have some vulnerabilities. But then, interestingly, here we do have the critical hits. So then I went over to Gerps, and this is specifically a table from Low Tech. So you can see we've got a bunch of information on a bunch of different types of armor, and this column here, DR, that's your damage resistance. And it notes the amount of damage resistance the item gives. The DR of some armor, such as mail, varies depending on damage type. So here we've got our weapon armor dynamics. See the notes after the table. The asterisk means that armor is flexible and susceptible to blunt trauma. So for instance, we have light layered leather armor, which has a DR of 2 and an asterisk. That means that it is flexible. We'll look up flexibility rules here in just a moment. Here we have medium scale armor, which has a DR of 4, and it has note number 4, which means that it is -1 DR versus crushing. Something like the heavy leather, which is DR 3, is -1 DR versus impaling, and so forth. Interesting note here that wood armor, which is DR 3, has the note semi-ablative, loses 1 DR per 10 points of basic damage it resists. This is our information from the basic set on flexible armor and blunt trauma. Flexible armor such as a leather jacket, mail hauberk, or modern ballistic vest is much lighter than rigid armor, but doesn't absorb the full force of the blows it stops. An attack that does crushing, cutting, impaling, or piercing damage may inflict blunt trauma if it fails to penetrate flexible DR. For every full 10 points of cutting, impaling, or piercing damage, or 5 points of crushing damage stopped by your DR, you suffer 1 HP of injury due to blunt trauma. This is actual injury, not basic damage. There is no wounding modifier. If even 1 point of damage penetrates your flexible DR, however, you do not suffer from blunt trauma. If you layer other DR over flexible DR, only damage that penetrates the outer layer can inflict blunt trauma. So here we have armor as damage resistance, and we have a lot of information on the interplay between different weapons through their damage type and the type of DR that they provide. I used to be a tremendous fan of all of this, but now I think it's too much. There are a tremendous number of different options here to select from, and there are a whole lot of different things to remember with different notes and asterisks and everything else to remember during play. I love it, but it is a lot to reference. As I was thinking about how this might be simplified, I thought about MERP, which I haven't thought about in a while, because it does have this kind of weapon armor dynamics, although it has a much simpler kind of armor system than does Gerps. So here are MERP tables, and you can see across the top of these that MERP just has plate, chain, rigid leather, soft leather, and no armor. So those are your armor categories right there. That's much easier than the multitude of different armor categories that Gerps has. But MERP makes up for that by having a different weapon table for every type of weapon. Not only just slashing and cutting or bludgeoning or piercing, but for instance, this is the one-handed slashing weapons attack table against those different types of armor. The one-handed concussion weapons attack table. The two-handed weapons attack table. The missile weapons attack table. And there are also unarmed attacks, and then claws and bites, and then you can get into many more different tables as well. And fortunately, it doesn't go into such detail as this is the short sword attack table. It just has one-handed slashing. So there is some amalgamation of the weapons into these tables, and then you could break out Rollmaster and get into a lot more detail as well. But here is our weapon armor dynamics. But I was wondering if you could take this more simplified armor categories and then put them onto more simplified damage categories. Something like this: soft leather, hardened leather, mail, and plate. There you go. That's what kind of armor you've got. And then you've got bludgeoning, cutting, and piercing. And then maybe if we had this designation of flexible, we could add that in there, but then we could say maybe this is damage resistance or something, so we've got 1s across the board for soft leather, 2 for hardened leather. Then mail is kind of interesting because it's 2s and 4s and 3s, as well as being flexible, and then you go up to plate and you get 5s, or whatever. The exact numbers here don't matter, we're just talking about the relationships between things. The actual dice or whatever we were rolling in whatever game system would determine what these modifiers are. But maybe you could simplify even further to just something like this: light armor, medium armor, heavy armor, extra heavy armor. What is the person wearing? Do we really need to get into the exact type of material everywhere? Maybe not for some kinds of systems. We just know that your opponent is lightly armored or not armored at all, lightly armored, medium armor, heavily armored, or extra heavy armor. And here I've got these as negatives. Maybe these are against your attack value or something like that. This is definitely simpler, but we are losing something about the weapon armor dynamics here. We're just talking about the armor and not the comparison between weapons and armor. It seems like to have that cross comparison, it does seem to work better if you've got the type of damage that the weapon does versus the material that the armor is made from. That seems to work better if you're going to be going down that road with your RPG. But anyway, those are my thoughts on weapon armor dynamics. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out some other videos on the channel if you did, and I will see you in the next video, where we will be discussing combat skill.